Okay, in this really short video, I want to show you how the new authentication contexts work when accessing SharePoint Online. I really did need to get my head around this because I really wanted to know what's the big deal, why do we need this, and how does it work? Well, to be very honest, it does work, but you do need specific licensing for in order to make this work, the E5 compliance, for example, or Microsoft 365 E5. Having said that, how does it work? Well, let's take a look at how it works right now. If you have specific conditional access rules, then you can apply these to SharePoint sites. This isn't really rocket science. It has been available for a long time right now. You could use PowerShell for this to really using the set SPO site command to set a conditional access policy for a specific site. Those options were limited basically to full access, limited access, or block access. In order to have these working, you really needed a conditional access policy. So just setting those, for example, using PowerShell or using the sensitivity labels, which is the option you see over here, you needed to have a conditional access policy to be able to enforce those. And we see things like this, requiring multi-factor, a device marked as compliant, etc. Those are basically the options we have. There weren't any other options which we do have when we have the full range of conditional access. So this is where those authentication contexts come in. So if we look at a conditional access authentication context, we can see that the authentication context in itself is basically a name, a description, a publication towards specific apps, but it doesn't really have any rules or anything like this. That's because the authentication context itself is coupled to a conditional access rule. So the conditional access rule is coupled to the authentication context, and the conditional access rule can set things like, again, granting access like this, but even more things like a terms of use, for example, or blocking access, or doing other checks, anything you really want to do based on that conditional access policy. The conditional access policy itself needs to be added towards a specific context. So that's over here. You really set it for a context, not a cloud app, not a specific action, really that, in my case, conditional authentication context, SharePoint confidential. So that's over here. So these two work together. And from a SharePoint perspective, either using the sensitivity labels or using PowerShell again, we can now set a specific authentication context. So the SharePoint site itself won't be limited to a one conditional access rule. No, it's now part of an authentication context, which, based on the connection with the conditional access rule, has specific access rules assigned. So that's basically the working and really the new option we have, although it's still in preview. So let's take a look at how this works in action. Conditional access for SharePoint Online sites have been around for some time. They were around before the sensitivity labels were able to set those conditional access rules. And they're stored within the metadata of a site. So, and if I just go for PowerShell, for example, and let me just show you SPO site minus identity. Let's go for this site over here, which is one of my demo sites. Oh, not MIC. Yep. And if I go to /conditional access policy, you'll see that there's the three options we already had before the authentication context. So I can have allow full access, I can have allow limited access, browser access, download print is disabled, or I can have block access. And these are conditional access policies which normally out of the box work for managed or unmanaged devices. So you can set an access policy for unmanaged devices, for example. And those are kind of limited because these only apply to accessing a SharePoint Online site. And conditional access has much more functionality, of course, one of which is to apply a terms of use, for example, for specific sites or specific environments. And that's where the authentication context comes in. Using the same set SPO site minus identity, etc. conditional access policy, I can set the authentication context. So instead of setting the conditional access policy to full access, for example, I can set it to authentication context. I already have one. I've got one here. Authentication context name is SharePoint Confidential, and it's connected to a conditional access policy. This conditional access policy allows me to set a terms of use and to ask for multi-factor authentication anytime this site is being accessed. This is using PowerShell. I can have the same functionality within the labels, within the sensitivity labels, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. So just to give you a check that this site is indeed configured for using the authentication context, I can do a get SPO site with the conditional and authentication parameters. So how does it look like? Well, let's go for that site over here. I'll try to log on. I'll use one of my accounts for this. Okay, go next, enter my password, let's go. And first of all, here we have the multi-factor authentication, so I'll just approve that one really quickly. If my authenticator app is working with me right now. Yep, there it goes. So let me just approve that one. Okay. Oh, I wasn't on time. Okay, let me approve it again. Here we go. Okay, so that's that was that, and I'll just say, yeah, I'll just sign in. Okay, and well, because of my conditional access, I'll be redirected to my terms of use. I've got my terms of use. To be very honest, I only just got a PDF I got from the internet for this, but yeah, it's a demo. I'll accept the terms of use, and just waiting for it. There's my Teams confidential site. Not really very well groundbreaking, but this is using those authentication contexts. So what did this authentication context just do? Okay, to see the conditional access in action, you just saw me connecting a SharePoint site using PowerShell to a authentication context. The context itself isn't really that difficult. I've got it over here. I've got just one authentication context. I've got a description. I've got a name. That's basically it. That's just it. You saw it being used within the PowerShell command line. Okay. So let me go for policies, and I've got my policy over here, SharePoint Confidential using via context. So let me just open this one up. You'll see I've included all my users for this, which isn't that many, to be very honest, in this environment. But over here I have my context. So instead of just selecting SharePoint or Teams or whatever, I know I want to use that authentication context because that's where my SharePoint site has been connected to. So that's over here. My controls are over here, very, very basic, just requiring MFA and using my terms of use. I have two terms of uses. I've got one I used in the demo just now. So that's basically it. Just create that context, use that context in a conditional access policy, and set your grant controls, your access controls based on that based on that conditional access requirement. Just to give you an update, if you use any of these two settings here, a client approved app or a app protection policy, those are MAM, mobile application management policies. So yeah, please be aware of those. But if I want to have more stringent access, I can require multi-factor, require either well, both joint and compliant, and I want to have those terms of uses. So I'll just select those. This is a conditional access policy. You'll need this, you'll need the context in order to have those access controls working. So let me just go back over here, and here you see the sensitivity labels. And this really makes our life very, very much less complex, because if we have those sensitivity labels and we can use the groups and site settings, so I'll just back off over here. I'll just go to my settings over here for this sensitivity label. You'll see I'm using it to protect files and emails, but I'm also using it to protect my groups and sites. So this is very easy. And if I go, well, I'll just skip this one because we're going for the container-based labeling. Over here, I don't have to modify any of these settings. Those aren't relevant right now. I don't have to set any of these settings as well, the privacy, but I do need to have those external sharing, because please be aware of this. The authentication context right now only works for SharePoint Online, privileged identity management, and MCAS. So any of these settings won't affect Teams as much. It will affect Teams within the document management part. And over here, I can have this one, and well, as you saw already, these are basically the three options I already had with the conditional access policy based on the site. But now I can have a authentication context, which is really cool. So I'll just have this one, and well, based on that conditional access authentication context, and based on this label, I have more options right now. For example, those terms of use, MFA, and well, much more. So this is, in a nutshell, how the authentication context works. Okay, just some final thoughts. This functionality I just showed you is still in preview. At the moment, you have a limited number of authentication contexts you can set within Azure AD. It also requires any user which is part of that conditional access policy using the authentication context to have an E5 compliance or E5 license signed. So it's really very heavy duty, if you will. Having said that, the compliance add-on is really very valuable, so take a look at that as well. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention.